Timaeus. The historical setting of the Timaeus is the late 5th century, not later than 421 BCE, and Timaeus himself is depicted as an old man, perhaps a third-generation Pythagorean, and so a contemporary of Philolaus. The actual dialogue was written towards the end of Plato's life, in the 360s, and is remarkable for several reasons. It is the earliest Greek account of a divine. Creation stars appear here for the first time as divinities, 7, and it is a theological work, but with no name for God. The Timaeus describes the processes of the creation before the appearance of the visible world. Much of it, therefore, deals with day one, and any correspondence would be with the secret tradition, although later texts show in some detail that the secrets of the Holy of Holies concern the initial processes of the creation. The antiquity of the belief is confirmed by Job 38. Job could not claim to be wise because he had not witnessed the foundation of the earth and its measurements, nor had he heard the sons of a god, the morning stars, singing as the world was formed, nor had he seen limits imposed on the sea. He could not bind the stars in their orbits, nor number the clouds. Ezekiel's equivalent vision, as he was handed the scroll, was a vision of the living one. The Timaeus uses the same term, living one, and seems to be setting out the same mythology in scientific dress. Ezekiel's prophecies are dated to exactly the period when Pythagoras would have been in Syria, and the remarkable similarities have to be explained. The Timaeus could be even closer to Pythagoras than the lore preserved in Philolaus and elsewhere, because it originated only 2 generations after Pythagoras and is not a series of disjointed fragments, many of which were preserved by a critic and a rival, and all of which passed through several hands. The Timaeus was much used by Philo. Parts of his exposition of Genesis on the creation of the world are simply quotations 888. Philo identifies Timaeus's demiurge with the God of the Hebrew Scriptures, but this is not the same as saying that he was the first to do this, or that it was a simple correspondence. Aristobulus, writing early in the 2nd century BCE, implied that the Timaeus had been based on Hebrew sources. Moses has been very carefully followed in all by Pythagoras, Socrates, and Plato, who said that they heard the voice of God when they were contemplating the arrangement of the universe so accurately made and indissolubly combined by God. When Philo recognized the demiurge as the creator, depicted in the Hebrew Scriptures, he knew that those Scriptures had also spoken of a second God, the Logos. The early Christians read the Hebrew Scriptures in the same way, but modern scholars, by and large, do not. They still find only one God in the Hebrew Scriptures, and thus have problems relating the Timaeus to the Bible, other than through the route of Philo, adapting the Hebrew Scriptures. When Philo wrote of the Father and Maker, e.g. Creation 7:10-21, he was not simply copying the Timaeus. The ancient Song of Moses had described the Father, Begetter, Maker, and Establisher of his people, Doid 32.6. Philo distinguished carefully between the one who was Father of the universe and the second God, his Logos, in whose image the human was made, for nothing mortal can be made in the likeness of the Most High One and Father of the universe. Q Genesis 4:2-6:2. It was this second God who corresponded to Timaeus's living creature, the model for the visible creation. It used to be thought that whatever had no parallel in the early rabbinic writings must have been imported from the Greek philosophers. But this approach belongs to the history of scholarship. Rabbinic Judaism is now recognized as a substantive change from Second Temple Judaism. Far from being trustees of the accepted tradition of Israel, the sages were leaders of a bold reform movement that developed in the aftermath of the destruction of the Jerusalem temple and took its shape in the first centuries of the Common Era. The implications of this are enormous. The polemic against the second God, which characterized so much early rabbinic writing 993, can be recognized as a struggle within the Hebrew tradition and not as a struggle against Hellenization. Philo's second God was no innovation but an expression in the Greek language of what had been Hebrew temple tradition from the time of the monarchy. What Philo said about the second God is important evidence for the nature and role of that second God, and the fact that there are so many similarities to the Timaeus is no longer proof that Philo simply adapted Plato. Philo's Logos was the Lord of the Hebrew Scriptures. the antecedent to all that has come into existence. Abraham 6. The archangel, neither, uncreated as God nor created as you, but midway between the two extremes. Hare 205 to 206. The eldest and most all-embracing of all created things. All int 3.75. The Logos was the high priest, thus linking the tradition to the temple, the firstborn, Abraham 102, the image of God through whom the whole universe was framed, Spec Laws 1.81, the bond of all things, Flight 112, the covenant, Dreams 2.37, the seal, Flight 12, the Logos, divided and kept things distinct, Hare 130, as well as uniting them. The Logos, a masculine noun, was also wisdom, a feminine noun. But Philo had no problem with this. Let us pay no heed to the discrepancy in the gender of the words, but say that the daughter of God is not only masculine, but also father, sowing and begetting in souls the aptness to learn. Flight 52. In this, Philo is consistent with the tradition of the second God having both genders. Briefly, wisdom and logos are both heavenly beings. Both are linked to the symbol of the menorah. Both are the image. Both are the firstborn. Both are agents of the creation. Both are bonds of creation. Both were given Israel as their inheritance. Both served in the temple, i.e., as high priest. Both led souls to God and transformed them. This list is not exhaustive, but as I wrote some time ago, those who would distinguish logos from wisdom have a hard case to argue. 94. What I am proposing reverses the established ideas of cause and effect. Philo was not simply adapting the Hebrew tradition to a more fashionable Greek model. The problems do not lie in bridging the thought worlds of Plato and Genesis in the time of Philo, but in trying to establish what lay beneath the surface form of Genesis and establishing the bridge, centuries before Philo, between the older Hebrew tradition and the Timaeus, exactly as Aristobulus and others had claimed. Runia made the usual assumption when he wrote, in attempting to explain Moses by means of Plato's Timaeus. Philo certainly did not solve all the exegetical problems involved, they but later recognized. Neither the Middle Platonist use of Tim 41 ab nor the Stoic doctrine of cosmic cohesion can fully explain Philo's frequent use of the image of the desmos, bond, in relation to the logos and the powers of God, so it is difficult to determine whether we are dealing with a personal predilection, at least partly resulting from his reading of the Timaeus, or with one of the many gaps in our knowledge of Philo's philosophical reading material. A gap in our knowledge of his Judaism is not considered. Philo drew his bonds from the older creation tradition, which also gave him the image of the seal, when discussing Philo's shift in imagery to include that of the seal and its imprint, where the ideas are regarded as seals which stamp their form on the unformed. Runia could find no obvious source. The description of the ideas as seals and the model as the archetypal. Seal is quite unplatonic and is to be attributed to Middle Platonist interpretation. It was in fact a fundamental part of the imagery of the first temple, the seal of the name, the letters by which the world was created being worn by the high priest and the guardian angel being regarded as the seal of perfection or proportion. The first temple had known El Elyon, God Most High and Father of the sons of God, whose firstborn had been Yahweh, the Lord, the great angel, the Holy One of Israel. The high priest king in Jerusalem had been Emmanuel, the presence of the great angel with his people. He had become divine at his anointing and had been given the 4 names. Wonderful, Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace, names which became in the Greek simply the Angel of Great Counsel, Isa 6. Alongside this, and there is insufficient evidence to see the scheme whole, or even to see it with the eyes of those who recorded the little we have, there had been the female aspect of God Most High, the Queen of Heaven and Mother of the sons of God, who had been the Mother of the Lord and therefore also of the earthly high priest king. But the Lord also had a female aspect. The second God was both, male and female, as Philo knew. In Timaeus' muddled account, the demiurge corresponds to God Most High, and the eternal living creature corresponds to the second God 98. Timaeus himself is introduced as an astronomer who has studied the nature of the universe. From the origin of the cosmic system to the creation of the human, Tim 27a, a comparison. Of his account of the creation and what can be recovered of the Older Testament, he reveals some extraordinary similarities. Timaeus begins his account with a series of statements that one must distinguish between what is and never becomes from what is always becoming, but never is, between the changing and the eternal, that a pattern is necessary for the product. To be good, that anything which changes must have had a beginning, and so the visible creation must have been brought into being, and that both the world and creator are good. These premises, which the dialogue does not question, could all have originated in the Hebrew tradition. The distinction between the eternity of God and the transient nature of physical life and human history is a commonplace in the Hebrew scriptures. The grass withers, the flower fades, but the word of our God will stand forever. Isaiah 40.8. The heavens will vanish like smoke, and the earth will wear out like a garment, and they who dwell in it will die like gnats. But my salvation will be forever, and my deliverance will never be ended. Isa 31.6. Also, PS 9.7, 33 to 10 to 11, 37, 18, 20, 90, 110, 102, 11, 12, 104, 3, 132. The divine pattern to which the craftsman works is fundamental to the accounts of the tabernacle and the temple, which represented the creation. Genesis begins with the story of how the world was created by God, and the recurring theme is that the creation was good, that God is. Good is fundamental to the Hebrew scriptures. There was no envy, thonos, in Timaeus's God, and it was deemed necessary to make this point twice. Timaeus's creator was different from the Greek gods. Timaeus is thinking of the common Greek view that the theon is thoneron, grudging in its bestowal of good things. Pythagoras had apparently been the first to call the heaven Oranos, the cosmos, cosmos. Diogenes Laertius 848, the word used here by Timaeus 28b. According to Burnett, the older meaning of cosmos had been the battle, array of an army. If these two statements are correct, then Pythagoras' choice of cosmos probably reflected the Hebrew host, Sabah, the old name for the host of heaven, which was the first to be created, or rather generated, Gen 2:1, Isa 40:26. The creator was the Lord of host, a title dropped after the work of the Deuteronomists and the changes to the temple, i.e., it was the older title. None of Timaeus's premises, then, is incompatible with an origin for his. Ideas in the older Hebrew tradition and the use of cosmos is consistent with this. Eusebius argued at length that Timaeus's, and therefore Plato's, premises about God were drawn from the Hebrew scriptures 1 or 2. Thus the distinction between what is and what becomes, Tim 27d, was, he said, simply an expansion of Exodus 3:14. Does it not plainly appear that the admirable philosopher has altered the oracle in which Moses declared, I am, that I am, into what is that which always is and has no becoming, that there is only one. Heaven, Tim 33a, was drawn from Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord, 6.4. That God is good, Tim 1, was also drawn from the Hebrew scriptures. Eusebius quoted Nahum 1.7 and Psalm 106:1. Moses had anticipated the teaching about the pattern and its copy insofar as Genesis 1 had described a light existing before the sun was created, and Timaeus' statement that the world must have had a beginning and a cause, Tim 28a, simply repeated Genesis, as did the statement that the heavens and the stars were created before the earth and its creatures. Preparation 11.9, 13, 21, 23, 29, 30. Most significant because this is an element of the Hebrew tradition that has been almost forgotten. Eusebius knew that there had been a second cause, whom the Hebrew oracles teach to be the word of God. Moses expressly speaks of two divine lords. Preparation 11.14. Monotheism is usually presented as characteristic of all the Hebrew scriptures, thus creating huge problems for understanding the origin of Christian beliefs about the second person. It can now be seen that monotheism was a relatively late development within the Hebrew tradition, a characteristic of the Deuteronomists and the temple reformers, And so when the early Christians read the Hebrew scriptures as an account of the second person in the history of Israel, this was not. Their special invention 103, the recognition that there had been a second person in the older. Hebrew tradition means that Eusebius could relate to the Timaeus with fewer problems than can a modern scholar. Timaeus speaks of the maker, poietus, and father of the universe, Tim 28c, who cannot be. Known and then of the architect, Tektainomenos, who constructed the universe, who is also named the Demiurge. These seem to be the same deity. An uncertain part of the text, then, seems to say that an exact account of the gods and the generation of the universe is not possible, Tim Taust 2c, which would be consistent with the hidden tradition of the Holy of Holies. The framer, Sunistas, wondered for set up the universe of change to be good like himself. He had found the visible universe in a state of inharmonious and disorderly motion, and he had brought it to order. This is not creation ex nihilo. In his second account of the creation, Timaeus returns to the question of the third element, the model, the copy, and then that into which it was copied. Tim 49a, 50 CD. This is envisaged either as a substance or as a space containing the qualities of the four elements, earth, air, fire, and water, and other things, but in a constant state of chaotic flux, like the contents of a winnowing basket. Tim 50. The creator's first action was to introduce order, making them out into shapes by means of forms and numbers. Tim 53b. The next process of creation in the Timaeus is described as binding together. Tim.tc, an element which can only be recovered for the fragments of the older creation, story which survive in the Hebrew scriptures. There then follows what seems to be a description of the eternal living creature, begotten by God and itself a blessed God, Tim 34ab. The universe itself was also begotten by the Father, who wanted to make it as much as possible like the eternal living creature, Tim 36 CD. Parts of this description correspond to the account in the first chapter of Genesis, where God did not create out of nothing. But when there was darkness on the face of the waters, he brought order to the earth, which was Tohu Wabohu 105. On the seventh day he rested and saw that everything he had made was good. This account is not from the first temple priesthood, but still has traces of the older tradition. Thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all the host of them. Gen 2:1 implies the creation of the heavenly host, even though this has not been mentioned. In that previously, and the origin of the host is implied, and these are the generations of the heavens and the earth when they were created. Gen 2.4. They were the offspring of the Creator, as stated in Timaeus 41a, when God addressed the gods. Other elements in Timaeus' account, such as God the Father and his sons, the living creature, and establishing the bonds of creation before the appearance of the creatures of land, air, and water, can be recovered from fragments of the older creation story which have survived outside Genesis. First, the recurring theme in the Timaeus of God as the Father, i.e., begetter of the eternal living creature and of the universe, resembles the ancient title for El Elyon, God Most High, attested in Genesis 14:19, the begetter, QNH, of heaven and earth. This is usually translated by the less specific maker of heaven and earth. El Elyon was also father of the sons of God, Doit 30.8, in the Qumran text for Qdik, just as the Demiurge was the father of the sons of God, Tim, Philab. The old title for El Elyon was modified in the wake of the temple reform, as can be seen from its reuse by Deutero Isaiah, who as the prophet of monotheism simply equated El and Yahweh and made the one God male. The whole idea of divine sonship and apotheosis, which had been central to the royal cult, was democratized so that everyone was a divine son. Do it. 381. El Elyon, the ancient procreator, Knovh, was identified as Yahweh, and the one God became the maker, rather than the procreator. The formula was expanded to your maker, stretcher of the heaven and founder of the earth, Isa 51.13, similarly 44.24. Or Yahweh became creator by Yas, Isa 42.5, or creator and shaper YSR, Isa 45:8. The old title for El was simply altered and taken over in some Psalms, Yahweh, maker of heaven and earth. is 115,015, 121, 2, 124, 8, 134, 3, 106. The variety of descriptions of the demiurge, especially that he was the father of the gods, and the creation reflects the situation before the introduction of monotheism in the wake of the reforms. This suggests that the demiurge, who fathered the eternal living creature and the gods, was modeled on El Elyon. Second, there is wisdom, the female figure described in Proverbs 8:22-31, who was begotten as the first of the Creator's works. The Father is named as Yahweh, but this may be another reassigned text. She was with him as the visible creation, was established, heaven and earth, waters and sea, but there is no mention of the three types of creature whose creation was committed to the sons of God, Tim Falad. In other words, she was the companion only in that phase of creation which corresponded to the work of the demiurge, and, like Timaeus' living being, she was the daily delight that rejoiced before him always, rejoicing in the inhabited world, and her delight was with the sons of men. Proverbs 8:31, my translation, CFUTM. And when the Father who had begotten it perceived that the universe was alive and in motion, a thing of joy to the eternal gods, he too rejoiced. Ezekiel had described her departure from Jerusalem, his living creature. Third, the bonds of creation were the bonds of the eternal covenant, which were renewed on the Day of Atonement. The imagery used in the Timaeus to describe the soul and its bonds is that of the Day of Atonement, and is but one of the many striking similarities to the older tradition. Timaeus explained that the soul had been formed by blending the eternal indivisible with the transient, divisible to form a third. The image used is of blending something in a bowl. Taylor suggested that this corresponded to the Pythagorean limit, the eternal indivisible, and the unlimited, the transient divisible, blending to form the 1107. These three were then distributed as the soul, divided initially into 7 portions, and then into further smaller portions set between the originals. The complete series of terms, choses, is intended to correspond with the notes of a musical scale. That's right. The resulting soul, imagined as a strip, was then divided lengthwise into 2, and the 2 halves laid across each other to form a cross. The ends of each strip were then joined to form a circle, resulting in 2 circles, one within the other, set at right angles, but then tilted. The inner ring was split into 7 smaller rings to be the orbits of the 7 heavenly bodies, sun, moon, and 5 planets, revolving at various speeds. This completed, the one who constructed it made the bodily within it, joining them at their centers. The body of the heaven was thus visible, but the soul, that is the reason, and harmony was not. Tim 34c 37. The soul was both in the midst and encircling. Nobody could say that this is a clear account. Taylor described it as the most perplexing and difficult passage in the whole dialogue. The language in which Timaeus describes the making of the world's soul by the mixing together of certain ingredients in a crater or mixing bowl, the subsequent distribution of the product in accord with the intervals of a musical scale, and the cutting of it into strips which correspond to the celestial equator, and the ecliptic is merely symbolical. Whatever is being reported here is garbled and justifies Aristotle's criticism of the Pythagoreans, albeit of another of their theories that they made. Their science conformed to their pre-existing ideas, not seeking accounts and explanations in conformity with appearances, but trying by violence to bring the appearances into line with accounts and opinions of their own. Heavens 293a. The underlying myth here seems to be whatever was expressed in the ritual of the Day of Atonement, when mixed bloods representing soul were sprinkled in the temple which represented the creation. Now, acknowledged to be one of the most ancient practices of the Temple 110, the rituals of the Day of Atonement were a part of the healing and recreation process at the New Year. The temple ritual was the act of renewal, but must have reflected the belief, now lost, as to how the world had been originally constituted. We have to compare the renewal rituals insofar as they can be recovered with framework into which Timaeus sets his scientific account of the creation. Deuteronomy has no place for atonement, and no account of the Day of Atonement. It does not even appear in the calendar. This was one of the crucial elements in the older cult. which the reformers suppressed. Atonement had become a controversial matter by the time the Pentateuch was compiled. Although we should not expect to find in Leviticus a full and clear account of the pre-exilic practice, there is enough evidence to begin the search. Blood is the soul life, NPS, and thus it affects atonement, i.e., healing and restoration. 11.11. On the Day of Atonement, blood was distributed in various parts of the tabernacle temple, which represented the visible and invisible creation, to remove the destructive and polluting effects of sin. Two types of blood were used on the Day of Atonement: the blood of a bull for the high priest and his house, Leviticus 16:6, and the blood of a goat as the Lord, Leviticus 16:8. These bloods were each sprinkled 7 times within the Holy of Holies, i.e., in day 1 eternity, and then together they were sprinkled on the altar in the Great Hall. The Mishnah gives more detail, presumably, of how the ritual was performed at the end of the Second Temple period, but there is no explanation of its meaning. 1. The high priest took the blood of the bull into the Holy of Holies and sprinkled it where the ark had been, using a special motion like a whip, whilst counting out a formula: 1, 1 and 2, 1 and 3, 1 and 4, 1 and 5, 1 and 6, 1 and 7. He then left that blood on a stand in the great hall whilst he took the blood of the goat into the Holy of Holies to perform the same ritual of sprinkling and counting. He then repeated the process in the great hall, sprinkling the blood separately on the curtain, the heavens. He then mixed the two bloods together in a vessel, pouring the bull's blood into the goats, and then returning the mixture to the first vessel with the mixed blood. He sprinkled the golden altar in the great hall, and then the altar of sacrifice in the temple courtyard, before emptying the remainder of the blood under the outdoor altar. The high priest then uttered the name aloud, the only time that this was done. Imam Yoma 5:3:6:2. This is how the process of recreation was ritualized in the temple. 2 types of blood, i.e., soul, were distributed separately with an inexplicable counting ritual in the Holy of Holies, day 1, and on the veil the second day, and then, mixed together, they were sprinkled in the part of the temple which represented the visible creation. 12. This ritual restored the bonds of the eternal covenant, which had been broken by sin. The account in Timaeus immediately links the distributed soul to the bonds which encircle the creation, and depicts these bonds as the means by which the heavenly bodies are held in their places. This binding of the heavenly bodies was part of the older creation story, as can be seen from the questions in Job. Can you bind the chains of the Pleiades or loose the cords of Orion? Can you lead forth the Mazzaroth in their season, or can you guide the bear with its children? Job 38:31-32. The similitudes of Enoch describe the process more clearly. Through the great oath bond, which is closely linked to knowledge of the name, the heaven was suspended before the earth was created, the earth was founded, and the sea kept within its bounds. The sun, moon, and stars were held in their orbits, and the Creator called to them by name. 1:69. On the Day of Atonement, the name was uttered at the completion of the sprinkling process, perhaps to seal what had been done. The idea of sealing the bonds was a key to the creation process, as can be seen from the undateable prayer of Manasseh, a prayer of repentance whose setting could well have been the Day of Atonement. Do not destroy me with my transgressions. Manasseh described how the deep was confined and sealed with the terrible and glorious name. In the book of Jubilees, Isaac had his son swear by the name, and the greatest oath, which created the heavens and the earth and all things together. Job 6:7. The name was worn on the high priest's forehead, and was the letters by which heaven and earth were created. It was also represented by a cross as early as the time of Ezekiel, as can be seen from the account of the destroying angels. Those to be saved were marked by the sign of the Lord, the letter Tau, which in Ezekiel's time was a cross, Ezekiel 4, translated Mark in many English versions. Thus the bonds of the creation in the first temple, had they been sealed with the name, would have been sealed with a cross. This is exactly what the account in Timaeus implies as just anew, Apology 1:60. The 2 strips of the world's soul were bound together in the shape of a cross. Timaeus described how One of the bonds was further split to provide the 7 orbits for the Sun, Moon, and 5 planets, and how these 7 were set to produce and mark time, living creatures with their bodies bound by the ties of the soul. Timaeus said. Timaeus then explained that the pattern for this system of soul circles had been an eternal living being, and that the Creator determined to have an even more exact copy of her, except that the copy could not be eternal. This would be the moving image of eternity. Timaeus said to 116. In order to complete the copy, there needed to be as many forms of life as there were in the perfect living creature. There are 4 of these: the gods in heaven, birds in the air, animals that live in water, and animals that go on dry land. Timaeus 40a. These were the creatures of the 4 elements: fire, air, water, and earth. Genesis 1 has only 3 of these: creatures of air, water, and land. The 4th group, the creatures of fire, were the angels of day 1 who have disappeared from our Genesis. These gods were made mostly of fire, distributed as an adornment for the heavens, i.e. they were stars, and they were given 2 types of movement only: rotation and moving forward. Timaeus' living creature, Zoon, the pattern for the visible creation, is what Ezekiel saw, leaving the temple. The prophet described what he saw as the Zoon singular, e.g. Ezek 1:21, 22, 10, 1:15, 17 LXX, or Zoa plural, e.g. Ezek 1:13 and 8:15 LXX, but for a divinity. This is a commonplace in Hebrew. Ezekiel also described 4 living creatures as components of the one, just as in Timaeus 39c, as many as exist in the living creature, so many should the world possess, and these forms are 4. Other words in Ezekiel's description suggest that he knew the distinction between the heavenly form and its visible appearance. Ezekiel was describing the visible form of something not normally seen. It was behind the veil in both senses, and so he distinguished between the form of the rings and their appearance, the form of the throne and its appearance, and so on. The similarity to or the role of Timaeus, living creature, is striking. Ezekiel's text is a curious mixture of feminine and masculine word forms. So he was surrounded by a ring within a ring, and these were full of eyes. Now eye is a word with several meanings. Zechariah, some 2 generations after Ezekiel, described the 7 lamps of the menorah as the eyes of the Lord which wandered through the earth. Zech 4:10, also in 2 Chron 9, but this would have been written later. These eyes must have been the sun, moon, and 5 planets. Might these also have been the eyes in the ring around the living one? This would explain why one of Timaeus' rings was split to make orbits for the 7 wandering heavenly bodies, the older mythology being modified for a more sophisticated astronomy. There is another link, too, between the wandering eyes and the ritual of the Day of Atonement. If this is only coincidence, it is a curious coincidence. The high priest in the Holy of Holies counted 1, 1 and 1, 1 and 2, 1 and 3, while sprinkling the creating, renewing blood with a movement like a whip. Yoma 5.4. In the Mishnah, the word is meslip, a word not found in the Hebrew scriptures, where the word for whip is from the same root as the word for the wandering eyes. Both are swit. As the high priest used soul to restore the bonds of the creation, might his movement originally have been connected to the wandering stars before he emerged from the Holy of Holies to restore the visible creation? According to the poem in 14x69, the great oath kept the heaven, the earth, the sea, and the sun, moon, and stars securely in their places. Some of Ezekiel's description of the living one is beyond recovery. One verse, Ezekiel Imso, seems to describe all flesh in the sense of all created things, as in the Lord providing for all flesh. It's 136, 125, or all flesh perishing if the spirit was withdrawn. Job 4:4 pf2. The Lord made a covenant with all flesh. Gen.9. All flesh together with backs, hands, and wings were within the rings full of eyes. Later texts, which preserved the older temple lore, show that the spirits of all things were believed to have been created on day one, and so it is not impossible that this was the original meaning of these curious words. Elsewhere, Ezekiel describes a female angel figure who was thrown from heaven and from her shrine, Ezek 28:12 to 19, and his description confirms that the figure had been the pattern. The poem has been reworked and now describes the king of Tyre, but originally the angel had been the guardian of Zion, unless we are to believe that several angel figures left the temple and cult in Jerusalem during the time of Ezekiel. He had been full of wisdom and perfect in beauty, the anointed or measuring cherub who protected or overshadowed. Ezekiel 8. He was described as the seal of proportion, Toknet, or the seal of the pattern Tabnet, Ezik Watawayet Bapwavs, the two words looking similar in Hebrew. Either meaning would correspond to what we find in the Timaeus. This angel had become proud and had corrupted wisdom, and so fire came forth from her midst, and he was consumed. The seal elsewhere is the role of the servant, the Lord, the high priest, who held the creation together. He was the eternal covenant. Isa 42.6, 49.8, rather than covenant to the people. And he had been drawn in outline and appointed a literal translation of Circ Wuth RSV, kept you and given you. This is the context for Philo's unplatonic image of the seal. The eternal living creature contained all life, as did the fourfold Pythagorean tetractes, the fount and roots of eternal nature. They must have been identical, as it is unlikely that one. System would have had two sources of life 118. Now the renewal ritual of the day of. Atonement was an outpouring of life soul to the creation, and the blood of the goat represented the life of second God present in the high priest king. The outpouring of his life renewed the creation, hence the juxtaposition of images in Peter's sermon. The holy and righteous one, the author of life, followed by a description of the Day of Atonement, and the anointed one returning from heaven. Acts 3:14 to 15, 19, 21. At his birth, the king had received the throne name, which in the Greek became simply Angel of Great Counsel, Wisdom, but whose Hebrew original had been fourfold. Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. EC 11.66 RSV. Translated more literally from the Hebrew, they bear a remarkable correspondence to aspects of Timaeus's eternal living creature. The similarity to wisdom is clear, wonderful, counselor. It must have been a god, since the universe which was its copy was a blessed god. Tim 34b. Mighty God, it was eternal, but its copy was in time. Tim thou 30. Father of time. It contained all things together within itself. Tim 30c. Prince of Shalom Ikig wholeness. Hengel wondered some time ago about the relationship between Jewish wisdom, not wisdom, speculations, and analogous Greek conceptions, but did not even consider the possibility that Aristobulus and others had been correct when they claimed that Moses had influenced the Greeks and not vice versa. He wondered if the world soul the Timaeus had influenced the depiction of wisdom in Proverbs 8, since Harmozusa, joining together, and Euphrainomen, Verthalion 30:31 seem so very close to the Timaeus. Both these translations, however, are close to the Hebrew original, and the question should perhaps have been, how could the Hebrew have been so close to the ideas of the Timaeus? The demiurge as a personal creator. God, he suggested, would have been close to Jewish thought, and perhaps the description in Wisdom 7:22-8:1 had been drawn ultimately from the Timaeus. Such is the power of presupposition. The description in Wisdom 7 probably does have much in common with the soul of the Timaeus, but this is because the two have a common origin, having described the living, one who was the pattern for the creation, Timaeus's demiurge, then addressed the gods who were his first creation, the beings of fire. He was there. Demiurge, maker. And Father, in other words, these beings were the sons of God. Although all that had been bound together could be dissolved again, such dissolution would not be good. You will never be dissolved nor taste death as long as you find my will a stronger and more sovereign bond than those with which you were bound at your birth. Tim Thal B. There are echoes here of the rebel angels who decided to break the bond, defy the will of the great Holy One, and bind themselves by a great oath into a bond of defiance. 1 and 4. The bonds of the sons of God and their rebellion against them was a fundamental aspect of First Temple theology, e.g., sons have I reared and brought up, but they have rebelled against me. Isai 1. In order to make the world a perfect replica of the living one, the Demiurge declared 3. More types of mortal had to be created, creatures in the air, creatures in the water, and creatures on the land. Since the Demiurge could only create what was immortal, the gods were commanded to create these 3 remaining kinds, weaving together mortal and immortal. The Demiurge then divided the impure remains of the world's soul to correspond with the number of the stars and left the gods to form bodies for the souls from borrowed portions of earth, air, fire, and water, loans which would have to be repaid. This too is biblical. Dust thou art, and to dust thou shalt return, was the curse on Adam, Gen.3 and Elihu knew that it was not only humans who returned to dust. When the Creator took back his spirit, all flesh would perish together and the human would return to dust. Job 34:14. Philo interpreted Genesis 1:26 as indicating that the Creator delegated certain tasks to his angels. The text plainly shows that he took fellow workers. Creation 75. The Creator handed over to the heavenly powers the creation of human beings. He allowed his subject powers to have the fashioning of somethings. Tongues 175, also Flight 6870. Other parallels in the Hebrew scriptures are equally remarkable. Deutero, Isaiah at a time. When the older system was being superseded, denied that such gods existed. Tell us what is to come hereafter, that we may know you are gods. Behold, you are nothing. Isa 41:21-24. When Adam had eaten from the forbidden tree, the Lord, the second God, addressing we, know not whom, said, the man has become like one of us. Gen. 3:22. The other gods were known to the Hebrew storytellers. Psalm 82, however, reflecting the older beliefs, describes another scene in the life of the gods and shows that they had been responsible for the affairs of the earth, just as in the Timaeus. They had failed in their duties of justice and care, and so they were to be punished. You are gods, sons of the Most High, all of you. Nevertheless, you shall die like a man, and like one of the princes you shall fall. A2.667, my translation. Words echoed in the Timaeus. Psalm 58 describes the failures of these gods on earth and includes their victims' prayer that God would destroy them, not unlike the supplications described in 1 Enoch. The souls of men make their suit to the holy ones of heaven, saying, bring our cause before the Most High, 1 Corinthians 9:3. As in the Timaeus, the immortality of the gods could be revoked. The bond of the eternal covenant which held the creation together could be destroyed. Isaiah's vision of the collapse of the created order is proof of this. Isaiah 4.45, and Jeremiah's assurance that the eternal covenant was secure and would never be revoked shows that this was an issue in the period of the exile, Jeremiah 35-36. The promise to Noah that the eternal covenant with all flesh was secure for all future generations was itself a product of the crisis of the exile after the destruction of the first temple, Gen. 9:12-17. It is clear that 2 Hebrew texts from the 6th century BCE have much in common with the Timaeus and with the teaching of Pythagoras. Ezekiel described a fourfold living creature who held all life, whom he saw set in a ring within a ring. In his vision, he distinguished between the forms and their appearances. He also described an angel high priest who was the seal of perfection proportion and had been the anointed measuring cherub in the mountain. Garden of the Gods. Deutero Isaiah. Isor 40-26, issuing a challenge to unknown opponents, described the Lord as the Creator who measured the waters, the heavens, and the earth. No mention of creating the mortals of air, water, and land. A Creator who had no likeness, who brought out the host of heaven by number and sat above the circle of the earth. The prophet mocked those who made an image that did not move. He also depicted the Lord challenging the gods and declaring that they were nothing. Isaphadim 21-24. The similarities between Pythagoras, Timaeus, and texts such as these are remarkable, and given the traditional dates for the Greek philosophers and the Hebrew prophets, cannot be. Coincidence. There are two possibilities. Either the Hebrew scriptures are to be dated so late that visions and oracles attributed to Ezekiel and poetry attributed to Deutero-Isaiah could have been influenced by Pythagorean philosophy from Italy, or there is truth in the later tradition that Pythagoras spent time in Syria in his youth during the lifetime of Ezekiel and Deutero-Isaiah, and while there had contact with the people who shared their worldview. Clearly, there were other influences into the Timaeus, there being, for example, no point of contact in the Hebrew tradition for the belief that humans could be reincarnated as animals. Tim Dowler 2c. The dominant mythology and theology, however, correspond to that of the Older Testament, which has been reconstructed independently of any of the Pythagorean or Platonic texts. It seems that the Pythagorean tradition is another route back to the ancient high priesthood. The similarities between the Essenes and the Pythagoreans and the natural affinity between Christianity and Platonism would have been due to their common origin in the first temple.